Good afternoon. I'm Steve Lowry, the editor of the High Low here at the Long Beach Post. Welcome to Live Chat. Today we'll be chatting with Kate Flach. I pronounced her name correctly. Most people don't. So congratulations to me. Kate, how you doing?
Great. How are you?
Terrific. Kate teaches at Long Beach State. She teaches in the history department. One of the things Kate teaches about is television, everything that we all know about television. And she has written extensively about race and television and actually had a terrific piece that I saw, I believe, last Thursday in the Washington Post. And what Kate was writing about was, given how television in the past, after the Watts Riots, after the unrest, after the Rodney King decisions, how television reacted to that and how it kind of informs what we can maybe expect to see coming out of the George Floyd demonstrations. Kate, I want to begin with this. Before we talk about what we're going to be seeing, what we're going to be talking about is programming that may be new, that might be pushing into new areas. Let's just talk about a procedural, first of all. How does television get made? We normally see a trailer for something 2 weeks ahead of time, and then there's the show. What is right now going to be the process by which people pitch shows and they end up on the air?
Historically, how television shows are pitched, they usually start with an idea. If it comes from the producer, and particularly if a producer is someone of status and stature and of name, that person might have an idea, and it could actually take quite a while to get the process of making a television show rolling. So, to give a historical example, the Hal Cantor, who was the creator of the show Julia, which came out in 1968, he actually had the idea for a show starring a Black protagonist, a Black nurse in particular, in 1965. He pitches it to NBC in 1967, and the ball doesn't get rolling for the production process for another year. And so usually the network itself decides whether they want to invest in a show. If they decide to do that, then the producer is going to come up with a writing team and actors, and they'll produce at least a couple of episodes, and then it depends on if the network wants to buy so many of those episodes. Usually it's the typical first 13. Sometimes the actors that they get to create the first couple of sort of mock episodes are not necessarily even the final actors that get placed in the final show that we watch on TV. So there's really a long process that takes place. That's at least true for entertainment television.
Okay.
So typically with historical moments of civil unrest or uprisings, when you have an immediate response to those uprisings, it's usually because those are some sort of special report or a live news show that is dedicated to maybe thinking about the history of institutionalized racism, maybe unpacking the current event that they're highlighting themselves, right? So those are a way that networks can immediately respond to what's going on, whereas the entertainment side, it usually takes a little bit longer. That's why sometimes entertainment TV can sometimes seem like it's behind the times
Right.
as
Yeah.
opposed to ahead of the times.
And of course, right now, I believe there is no TV production going on because of the coronavirus, right?
Correct. Well,
Yeah.
TV production via Zoom, however that.
This is about as far as it goes.
Yeah.
You know, they say that, I believe they say drama plays is more of a writer's format. Film is more of a director's format. In television, who is the most powerful? Is it the producer? And we're seeing more writer producers, by the way. Are they the people who tend to hold the most power and can get things done the most and the quickest?
What I found through my research, that is absolutely correct. It is the
Okay.
producer that holds the most amount of power. The more famous the producer is, like in our current time, we would think of a famous television producer as someone like Shonda Rhimes.
Okay.
Historically, someone like Norman Lear. When they have a bit more power, they are able to negotiate their power and what they want on television a little bit more because of their stature.
Okay. So, given your knowledge of history, what do you think has been going on in those producer offices at the homes of writers the past 2 or 3 weeks after the Floyd demonstrations started? What kind of conversations are going on right now that eventually may lead to different kinds of programming?
I think they're probably experiencing a lot of introspection and trying to really think about their own role, not only within the moment, but even thinking about, why hasn't television changed that much over time? The point that I wanted to come across with the piece that I wrote for the Washington Post was to say that this is not something new. The reaction that these television personalities are having is not something that's very unique to 2020. This is something that they've had every time there has been a historical uprising that has taken place since television has been around.
Right.
Um, so I'm assuming that they're doing a lot of introspection, especially when it comes to thinking about not just the TV shows that are out there that have Black actors that are starring in them, but even thinking about the creators, the writers, the producers, the CEOs, all of those people at the top. Just today, actually, the Hollywood Reporter came out with an article on this very subject, and there was even a list of 4 points that the author of that article thought that the television industry could do to address these problems. And one was to release their diversity data every single year, along with their Nielsen ratings and all of the other statistics that they publish. So there's definitely pressure coming from the side of people who are drawing attention to media's shortcomings in all of this. So I would suspect that networks and executives are really thinking about what their next move is.
And I think it goes without saying, but I guess it bears repeating, though it may make news when there is a Black actor in a role that we don't normally see, and a lot of people get excited about that.
Mm.
It is far more important, and to the long range success of this, that those Black people are behind the camera, because obviously that's where real power lays, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say behind the camera, right? Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about some specifics. Let's go back to the Watts riots and what happened after that. What was the reaction? Now, back then, we're talking about a time when there's 3 networks: NBC, ABC, and CBS. That's it.
Right.
And there's very, very limited primetime programming. The numbers that shows back then got were enormous because there was nothing else to watch. I was a kid then, I know. What was the reaction of Hollywood / television to what happened in Watts?
So what's interesting with Watts is what I found is that the response really starts with these grassroots organizations that I highlight in my article, starting with the Watts Writers Workshop that was started by TV Hollywood producer Bud Schulberg.
Mhm.
But the television industry itself was already, even prior to Watts, kind of moving in this more what I call like a liberal direction with the way that they wanted to tackle and address race issues. So prior to the Watts uprising of 1965, you have the famous quote by the FCC chairman who was appointed by John F. Kennedy, Newton Minow at the time, that television is a vast wasteland, right? And so there was already this push to do something meaningful and impactful for TV because TV was very much new. The technology developed after World War II, but you don't have the majority of Americans who own a television set until 1960. So they viewed the television set as a way to educate the American public about these issues that were happening in real life. And this is also overlapping with the civil rights movement. So the industry was already really in tune with trying to make these changes.
Mm.
Prior to 1965, it was more common to have white producers and writers writing about race issues. After 1965, you're going to have more of a push to include Black people into that writing process. So the change that happens immediately after Watts is you're going to have more people who are considered specialists or even experts, right? So maybe Black psychologists who come in and they sort of look and participate on the set itself. So after 1968, when you have the uprisings that happen in response to Martin Luther King's assassination, that's when you start to have more of an inclusion of Black writers, not just Black psychologists who are overseeing the production. More Black writers, Black actors themselves, and even the Black actors who are sitting down with the writers and talking about like how can our voices be reflected in these scripts in the television production itself.
Kate, let me ask you, it's one thing to bring in Black writers and Black actors, but if those Black writers and Black actors know that the real power lays with some white people, usually white guys,
Mhm.
could there be a tendency that they are writing for their white boss, and therefore trying to make it more palatable, and therefore they might be pulling back, that they're not telling their complete truth, but a truth that makes white people comfortable?
That is the critique of 1960s and 70s programs, because they had to reach a larger audience, right? Whereas when you get into cable and now with these streaming network or streaming devices, you don't have to reach a wider audience. It's a bit more niche.
Mhm.
People tend to self-select, so they tend
Yeah.
to watch TV shows that they maybe already tend to agree with politically, or fall along their lines of their subjectivity and how that's being reflected in the TV that they're watching. So that is definitely the critique of the early 60s and 70s television. What's interesting though is if you were to go back, if anyone who's watching this thinks to look up some All in the Family episodes from the 1970s, the topics that are being addressed on network primetime television seem almost uncomfortable for us to watch as contemporary viewers. I have actually, as a professor, wanted to include All in the Family episodes while teaching, and have found that as I'm rewatching episodes that I grew up with watching, um, I almost feel like I can't show this in the classroom because of
Right.
the way that they're addressing certain things, and they use very candid and aggressive language in the process of addressing certain topics. So on the one hand, there is the argument that it causes TV to be too watered down, but at the same time, I feel like the moment that was the late 60s and early 70s, it created a space that allowed that type of television programming that really pushed certain topics to the edge and to the limit, to it allowed that to air on TV.
You point out in your piece that after Watts and certainly the late 60s, you get this push, you get more Black voices in there, certainly with writers. But by the mid to late 80s, this had almost completely dissipated. That again, we were at a point again where you have very few Black writers. It, what happened was it something that was simply fashionable that became unfashionable? Why all of a sudden did it go back to the way it'd been before 68?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I do think it was the transition and the shift in television itself, so that even the Black producers and writers who were there, right? There was a Black producer for the spinoff of A Cosby Show, A Different World, and you also had Black writers working for Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But those shows, the premise of the shows were really focused on like family values, whereas the premise of television shows in the decades prior were really focused on looking at class and race and gender issues. And that was the forefront of those shows. So I think that even with the transition and the way they wanted to create shows that had a different purpose, I think that contributed to the muting of certain topics, particularly those related to race and racism, systemic racism. So you have that transition happening. And then I also think that there is something particular that happens with networks, which is to think that writers of color can only write for shows that have Black characters.
Right.
And that's not to say that Black writers should not work for those shows that feature predominantly Black casts. But there is something to be said about how networks might think that a white producer or a white writer can work in a lot of, put their hands in a lot of different pots and
Right.
engage in a lot of different TV shows with different types of content. But that's not necessarily, I don't know if they necessarily view that the same way that they do for writers of color. And so I feel like when those shifts happen, whether it's because they want to focus on family values or whatever, whatever it is that networks are, moving and shaping and shifting, I think that kind of gets used as an excuse to, uh, diminish the amount of writers of color that are being hired.
I always mess this up, Kate. So I'm supposed to talk to our wonderful audience out there and mention this show is yours too. We're all chatting. So please, if you have any questions, any comments for me, for Kate, here's a little trivia. Different World, which Kate mentioned, my brother was an ongoing character on A Different World. How about that? He was the boyfriend of one of the characters. Hey, look at that. Okay, so I got some trivia there. I want to jump ahead. I want to go back to 92, but you mentioned something. We talked about this before. I'm a white writer. No one ever says to me, well, you can only write about the white experience. I can write about whatever the hell I want, sci-fi, this, that. But we do know that writers who are called Black writers, Mexican writers, Asian writers, instead of just writers, many times get pigeonholed into writing about certain subjects. Right now, obviously, as you say, there are going to be a lot of producers thinking about shows that reflect the Black experience. While this, I think everyone can agree, is a positive thing, are there going to be writers out there of color who say, you know, that's great if you want to do that. I want to write about Mars. That's what I want to write about. Are they going to have trouble finding gigs because people are always going to want to get them, hey, write about your experience? What happens if they don't want to write about their experience?
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate to say that, you know, everybody approaches, whether it's academically, whether it's for someone's desire to participate in the entertainment industry, whatever it is, we usually pursue writing with different for different reasons, right? We have different, I wouldn't say it's an agenda, but there's different passions. And a lot of the times what we want to write about and who we're writing for can change over time. We have different interests that evolve as people. We're not stagnant. And so I think that that's absolutely true, that there might be writers of color who want to write about lots of different topics that aren't just limited to always about an experience per se. That you know, but I think that also when you have a diversity of people who are working behind the scenes, it creates a much richer and a better quality of programming. And I think that the few programs that have included a diversity of writers, they've proven to be very successful. And I think that that can be attributed to that diversity that's behind the scenes.
Let's jump back now to 92, the reaction to the Rodney King decisions. So we have this period after 68 where we have more inclusion. By the mid to late 80s, this is now dissipated, and 92 happens. What happened after 92?
So directly after 92, you do have an increase in those special reports that I was talking about, right? They're responding specifically to the 92 uprisings. And so you have an increase in that type of programming. You do have a shift with the television programming itself, broadening in terms of having more TV shows that have mostly all Black casts that happen after the 1992-93 television season. So you have an increase there. But what's interesting is that you also have the culture wars that develop out, you know, during the 1990s. And this is particularly in response to the type of programming that's being produced in these mainstream venues as well. So there's always this sort of pushback and this back and forth that's going on with how television is being produced and the pushback that it receives. And so that's something that I think that the television industry now needs to prepare for in terms of thinking about what is your agenda? I mean, what do you want to come out of this moment doing? And what are you prepared to do in spite of the pushback that they're inevitably going to receive as television content changes? So I focused specifically on the 1960s and 70s, and I found in my own research that when you have a shift in television programming that seems dramatic, there's a lot of times a lot of pushback that viewers express. My time is viewer mail. I don't know if anyone writes a letter anymore. I think it's probably all through Twitter. Right. But a lot of people are uncomfortable with these changes in television because they do view TV as having an impact in our lives, particularly in the lives of young people. And so when they find that it's moving in these directions that they are uncomfortable with, you know, that's usually where you get the pushback coming.
Speaking of having an impact, television can have an enormous effect about how we look at certain groups and by how they are portrayed. One of our viewers asked, what role has the TV industry played in maintaining negative stereotypes and contributing to the dehumanization of racialized communities?
That's a really good question. I would say especially historically, television has played a major role in stereotyping, particularly through entertainment dramas and sitcoms. Um, my perspective when I see the responses that people have in response to those types of images, the aside from the stereotypes themselves, but when you have shows, I focus on the 60s and 70s. I look at shows like Julia and Good Times. And even when there was an increase in those types of shows that had characters of color on them, there were still very few within the larger TV landscape. I mean, television up to that point had been dominated by pretty much all white actors and white stories, right?
Right.
And so usually what happens is there's a lot of critique of the very few shows that do have um, uh, characters of color on them. And I think that has to do because they're so limited. So when you only have one or two shows, you know, that focus on African Americans, or one or two shows that focus on LGBTQ characters, or one or two shows that have Mexican Americans, people look to those television shows to sort of encompass all people. You don't do that with white shows because white, right? I mean, you've got white shows with white characters who are, you know, poor, middle class, wealthy, living different types of lifestyles in different parts of the United States, and they have all different types of characters and feelings and representations, and they cover so much that you don't typically have white viewers who look to one television show to feel
Right.
like it's representing ourselves.
Right.
Right. So I think that even when we think about how television shows stereotype, I think even when they're trying not to stereotype, when there's so little representation, it sort of, you know, it creates a lot of discontent about these shows because we're only looking to a couple to, you know, represent a large group of Americans.
And is this even more dangerous, this kind of stereotyping, when it is done under the guise of reality TV, which of course we all know, you and I both know, I hope most people know, is basically a scripted show. And
Right.
people are playing characters. And yet there is the possibility that people say, well, see, it's reality TV. So that's how that person, and maybe in their mind, that group acts, right? Is there a danger that reality TV really, someone thinks like, well, this is the way it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't thought of reality TV in that way before. I mean, reality TV has its own sets of, you know, issues. It's its own beast in a way.
Right.
But I do think so, especially when you get to like their reality TV that play. I'm trying to think about how I want to answer this question.
Hmm.
That's a really good question. I think that sometimes reality TV too can be used as a way to maybe address some of the racial disparities in the
Mhm.
entertainment industry with, you know, reality TV actors themselves are paid very little compared to, I mean, they're paid a lot for the average American, but when you're talking about what actors themselves are playing or making who are starring in these television shows, it's a drop in the bucket. So I think it's a way to address the diversity or lack of diversity issue for a lot of networks without maybe necessarily paying them a lot.
Yes. And yet they
And
can
so,
make an incredible connection with the audience through
right,
social media and things like that. Yeah.
right. So there's a lot of issues with reality TV. I am actually, it's one of the things I've been thinking about, which how is reality TV going to survive the
Yeah.
pandemic of the coronavirus? It did come, you know, reality TV really came into its own during the Great Recession because there, you know, we're lack of funds for creating new television shows, and so this is where you have the boom of reality TV. And now with the inability to get people together in this way, I think the coronavirus might impact it negatively, and that might not be a bad thing for us to sort of rethink the role of reality television and you know what it's doing and how people are responding to it during this time.
I want to talk to you about, I turned 59 in 2 days. How about that? Oh no, I turned
Happy,
59 tomorrow. See, I'm already losing
happy
it.
early birthday.
Anyways,
It's my
thank you very
cousin's
much.
birthday
Thank you very
tomorrow
much.
too.
When I was a kid, there were 3 networks. The numbers for television shows were enormous. And you had this thing like, let's say MASH's last episode, where it really was a shared experience. You mentioned earlier that because of streaming services, we're getting much more niche kind of programming and marketing. And you were saying that that can be a good thing for Black producers, Black writers, because they can tell their story and get it on the air pretty much like they want to on certain services. Is there a problem, though, that you start to almost balkanize programming so that you only have certain people watching certain shows that make them feel good, that play already to things that they already think? And we're not having these kinds of national kind of programming that then causes people to talk to each other about things, to say, wow, that was weird. What, those kinds of things. Is that kind of programming a thing of the past? And is that a bad thing for what we're talking about?
I do think it's a thing of the past. It has its pros and cons. At the same, I guess maybe I don't think it is as bad as we might initially think. And I'll tell you why. It's because when there was network programming, there were only three, or where they dominated the television industry. There were only three networks, and they had these television shows that pushed the envelope. They talked about race directly in the television show itself. And they had, cast with almost all people of color, for the 60s and 70s, mostly all African American casts. They still received a lot of hate mail. And so even when those viewers, when those shows were created to appeal to a mass and a large amount of viewers, those shows still received hate mail from predominantly white viewers who felt like the TV shows themselves were sort of a marker or a place marker for integration. So they viewed it just the way that people might have viewed busing or actual school desegregation. They thought of
Right.
TV in the same way. So even when they were trying to appeal to a mass audience, they still couldn't change the minds of certain people, right? When that
Mhm.
was what they set out to do, that was their goal. Hal Kanter, the creator of Julia, actually called it his thesis, right?
Mm.
So to have cable television and also to have these streaming devices create all of these different ways in which people can watch TV, but maybe creating a better or more in-depth or raw way of looking at race in America that's not as watered down and not as filtered. I don't think those shows would change certain people's minds anyway. So why continue to produce television that's watered down? I guess let's just keep producing TV that is cutting edge, and maybe they'll get new viewers. I think that does happen. I think entertainment does play a role in the way people think about race and gender and sexuality issues. And so I think thinking that it doesn't make a difference might become a way to make an excuse as to why it shouldn't be different.
And I think we find, especially with younger viewers who are so much more sophisticated about images, about marketing, about advertising, all that kind of stuff, younger viewers will go find quality.
Right.
They do it all the time, right?
Yeah, so they do, and I have the privilege to work with college students, and they're always they know I study television, so they're always telling me about a new show or something on YouTube that I need to watch, and it's really great because I feel like they have their finger on the pulse of what is going on, sort of off the mainstream a lot of the times, and I'm privileged to be able to be around these students who are always telling me about the new things that are out there for me to be aware of.
And what does a college professor who studies television, what is her latest discovery that she loves? Greatest TV show lately that you've been watching?
The latest TV show I've been watching, good question. Well, I've been without childcare for a few months, and I'm still, as we were teaching online,
Kate
so
has a 2-year-old.
TV has taken a back burner. Been watching the new season of Queer Eye,
Mhm.
and I really like that show for the way that I like the show for the way that it presents a new way of thinking about body positivity,
Mhm.
and thinking about how we come to maybe see ourselves and find happiness within ourselves that is maybe non-conforming to the status quo. And so
Mm.
that's one of the takeaways I get from that show that I really enjoy. And I, even when I have very little time to watch TV, I will tune into that show right now.
Mm. Terrific. Kate, thank you very much for being here. This was very, very informative and a lot of fun.
Thank you. It was fun for me. I really appreciate you having me on.
Terrific. And you have to know this is a bit of a medical miracle because literally seconds before we went on, she had an incredible sneezing jag, and now she's fine.
10 sneezes at
What a
least.
performer. Rose the occasion. Hey, this was terrific. Live chat. We will be back tomorrow. Maybe, I'm not sure actually, but we'll be back soon. Again, thank you for participating and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you too. Bye.